Why was the colonel's voice shaking when he gave the order? It wasn't fear of the enemy. Not exactly. It was the weight of a command that might end a dozen lives. Get me anything that flies. Just get it here now. The words cut through the operations room like a blade, sharp and final. His tone wasn't one of hope, but of desperation. The kind of desperation that comes when you've already run out of options and know that something, anything, has to give. The air inside Fort's command center was thick, humming with an energy that made the fluorescent lights seem harsher, colder, more merciless than usual. Screens glowed in shades of amber and green, painting the room in a sickly light that highlighted every crease on Colonel's face. He'd carried commands before, hundreds of them, but tonight was different. On the central display, a red icon pulsed like a heartbeat that was about to stop. Echo Unit 3. A dozen men, pinned in a ravine, surrounded by enemy fire that grew heavier with every passing second. Communications were garbled, cut short by explosions and the hiss of jamming signals. The last transmission had been a plea, a human voice crying out for air support that wasn't coming. Didn't need visuals. He'd been there once years ago. He could imagine it too well, the feeling of being a sitting duck, deafened by enemy fire, lungs burning from dust and smoke, searching desperately for cover where there was none. That memory, buried deep, locked away, stabbed him in the gut now, sharper than any blade. "Comms," he rasped, voice low but charged. "Status." A young officer, barely steady, swiped at his console. His hands betrayed him with tiny tremors. "Sir, still intermittent signals. Heavy jamming, we can't get a clean lock. Last message, request for immediate air cover. They said," he swallowed, unable to meet the colonel's eyes. "They said they're out of time." The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The room seemed to hold its breath. The colonel's jaw tightened, the muscle in his temple twitching. He turned to the flight operations officer, a woman with a no-nonsense edge who rattled off the grim report. "F-35s are still grounded, sir. Avionics failure, manufacturers still working on the patch. F-18s are refueling at Auxiliary Field C9, priority 1 for Operation Sandstorm. They cannot be diverted. And north of ZK-4, microburst storm system. Low altitude passes suicidal." Her words landed like blows, each fact another nail sealing the coffin. "ETA on F-18s. 42 minutes, absolute best case." 42 minutes, they didn't have 5. His hand pressed against his face, scraping over stubble. The rules said wait. The book said prioritize the greater mission. But the thought of 12 men bleeding out in silence while he checked boxes on a form was a poison he couldn't swallow. His fist slammed the command table. The sound cracked through the room, making the younger officers flinch. "Damn the book." His voice wasn't loud, but it was raw, guttural, almost primal. "Find me anything that flies. A jet, a helicopter, a damn biplane, anything that casts a shadow over that valley. I don't care if it's a museum piece. Get me a distraction, something to give those men a reason to hold out 5 more minutes." For a moment the room moved again. Fingers flew across consoles, searches lit up across channels, staff scrambling like they were hunting for a ghost. Desperation was fuel, but it rarely brought results. Everyone knew it. And then, "Sir," a quiet voice from the back. A junior officer, eyes flicking nervously between his screen and the colonel's back. We have one pilot, an A-10. Her birds fueled and armed at Auxiliary." Turned slowly. His expression was a mask, disbelief wrapped in contempt. "An A-10, he repeated. The way he said it was less a word than a curse. "That relic, that bulldozer with wings." His anger rose with each syllable. "I asked for a surgical tool, stealth, precision. You bring me a rusty hammer." He waved the young officer off with disgust, dismissing him like a foolish child. The moment passed. Reality crashed back. 42 minutes until the F-18s. 12 soldiers who didn't have 42 seconds. He felt the inevitability pressing down, cold and merciless. Then another voice, flat and steady, cut through. "Sir, radar contact." The room stilled again. The radar tech, Miller, gray hair, lines cut deep into his face, wasn't one to mistake signals. His monotone was laced with something unusual: alarm. No transponder, no IFF. Low altitude, terrain hugging, clear signature, heading straight for ZK-4. Froze, staring at the green blip slicing across the digital map like a knife. Unauthorized, unmistakable. He knew that profile, that reckless precision, that speed. It wasn't a rookie, it wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't anything the system allowed. His blood ran cold. He turned to the junior officer, the one who had dared suggest the A-10. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were wide with something more than fear, something like awe. "There's only one pilot who flies like that," the young man whispered, "and she's not supposed to exist." The room fell into silence. Those words were a key unlocking doors had bolted shut years ago. Memories he had buried under protocol and denial flooded back. Operation Red Dagger, the comms blackout, the desperate dying calls from a recon squad the system had written off. He remembered watching a radar screen then, too, watching as one pilot, a young woman with a steel gaze, ignored every order, every rule, and saved lives no one else had bothered to count. Her name was, call sign, Falcon 7. She had been condemned, grounded, stripped of rank, erased from the roster. But the screen in front of him told a different story. That flight path, that ghost blip was her. His breath caught, his voice dropped into a whisper meant only for himself. No, not again. But it was. The ghost had returned. That was just the opening of her reappearance. But already the colonel felt the trap of paradox tightening around him. She was a liability, a rogue, a direct violation of everything he believed in. And yet, she was the only hope left. He reached for the comms mic, his hand trembling despite himself. "Unidentified A-10, state your ID and return to base. That's a direct order." Nothing but static. Miller glanced up, concern etched deep. "Sir, she's flying silent, either not receiving or she's choosing not to." His grip on the mic tightened until his knuckles went white. He tried again, harsher now, voice low and threatening. "Falcon 7, I know who you are. You are not cleared for this op. Return to base. Do not force me to classify you as hostile." The threat was hollow, and they both knew it. He couldn't shoot down an American pilot flying to save American soldiers. He was caught between duty and conscience, protocol and humanity. The static hissed. Then finally a voice broke through, calm, focused, unshaken. "This is Falcon 7. I hear you, Colonel. Echo 3 needs help. I am in position to give it." No arrogance, no defiance, just a statement of fact. And in that moment, knew the decision wasn't his anymore. That night in Fort's operations center, something had shifted. The rules didn't matter. The manual didn't matter. What mattered was 12 lives waiting in a ravine, praying for a savior they had no reason to expect. And a ghost had answered. His eyes closed, pain etched into his features. His voice, when it came, was not command but surrender. "Falcon 7, you are cleared to engage." He didn't wait for her reply. He knew she'd already begun her run. The room fell into silence. All eyes locked on the radar screen as the blip dropped even lower, skimming the terrain like a phantom. Every second dragged like an eternity, and on the ground, Echo 3 braced for death until they heard it. A sound not of surrender, but of salvation. The growl of a warthog. What does salvation sound like when you've already accepted death? For the men of Echo 3, it began as a vibration under their boots. A low, guttural rumble that didn't belong to the chaos around them. Pinned against the jagged walls of the ravine, their rifles nearly dry, every breath a struggle against dust and smoke, they thought they had heard every sound war could make. The whine of mortars, the sharp rattle of machine guns, the sickening thud of bodies hitting ground. But this was different. At first, some of them thought it was thunder. Others feared it was another enemy tank rolling into position. Then the shape cut through the fog, heavy, low, unmistakable. The sergeant, voice cracking, screamed through the haze, "That's a warthog! We've got air! We've got air!" Disbelief turned to raw, guttural hope. Heads lifted, eyes widened. The men who had already made peace with dying suddenly found their lungs filling again, breaths sharp, alive. Above them, Falcon 7 flew like a shadow made flesh. Her A-10 skimmed the ravine walls so close the ground forces swore they could see rivets in her wings. She wasn't a whisper of stealth like the F-35s. She wasn't a distant flash like the F-18s. She was presence. She was defiance with engines. Back in Fort's ops room, the radar tech Miller muttered under his breath, "She's flying visual." His tone was professional warning and personal disbelief twisted together. In this fog, in this smoke, there's no way she can get a lock. But Falcon 7 didn't need a lock. The next sound silenced the doubt. A roar so deep, so resonant, it shook the glass in the command center and rattled bones miles away. The GIU-8 Avenger. Not just a gun, a force of nature, 7 barrels spinning at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The kind of weapon designed not to fire but to devour. It wasn't the clean snap of a rifle. It was the sound of the sky itself tearing open. Down in the ravine, Echo 3 ducked instinctively as the cannon thundered overhead. But then their ears caught the difference. The rounds weren't wild. They weren't blanket fire. They were precise. They tore into the enemy nests, chewing through fortified positions like paper, yet never strayed near the trapped soldiers. In the space of seconds, the impossible had happened. Enemy emplacements that had pinned them down for hours erupted into fire and smoke. Echo 3 didn't just cheer. They screamed with the kind of primal relief that comes when life claws its way back from the grave. Direct hit, their comms sputtered, voices raw with disbelief. 3 nests gone clean. Heard it all, every transmission, every roar of the GAU-8, and with each report, something inside him broke apart. This shouldn't be happening. Not because of the enemy, not because of the storm, but because by every calculation, by every model, by every rule he had lived his career by, this strike was impossible. And yet it was happening. His mind flickered back to another screen, another lifetime, Operation Red Dagger. He could see it clearly, even though he'd spent years trying not to. The recon unit trapped, their cries for help swallowed by static, the enemy jamming so strong it drowned out every attempt at coordination. Command's verdict, stand down, too dangerous, too late, too hopeless. He had given that order. He had told men to wait for help that would never come. He had signed off on their silence. And then back then, too, a rogue blip had appeared. An A-10, unsanctioned, tearing through the blackout like it belonged there. He remembered standing at the same kind of console, watching with awe and fury as Falcon 7 flew not to destroy but to shield, drawing fire, creating chaos, turning herself into bait so others could crawl to safety. He remembered thinking, she won't survive. But she had, barely. Her jet had landed like a corpse falling onto a road, smoke pouring from its wounds. She climbed out, bloodied, burned, alive, and every soldier she'd gone in for was alive too. For that she was erased, punished, forgotten. Now here she was again, flying not because she was cleared, but because she refused to watch men die while bureaucracy waited. In the ops center, his hand trembled on the edge of the console. His voice cracked into the silence. She's not supposed to be here. Miller, eyes glued to his radar, whispered back, maybe she was never supposed to leave. The roar of the GAU-8 faded for a heartbeat. Then the comms filled with Echo 3 again, shaky, breathless, alive. Base, this is Echo 3. The pilot, whoever she is, we're still here because of her. The room erupted in whispers. A miracle had unfolded before their eyes, one that no manual, no report, no calculation could explain. Clenched his jaw. He had condemned the A-10 as a relic, a blunt instrument in a world that demanded precision. But now he was watching that so-called relic carve surgical lines of fire with impossible accuracy. 60 rounds, a tech officer murmured after reviewing telemetry. Her voice was pale with awe. She only fired 60 rounds. The number landed like a physical blow. The GAU-8 was meant to overwhelm, to drown targets under sheer weight, but Falcon 7 had wielded it like a scalpel. A sledgehammer turned into a scalpel, a cannon turned into a brushstroke, and suddenly understood what he was really seeing. This wasn't technology, this wasn't the jet. This was her. Falcon 7. Flying not with systems, not with computers, not with permissions, but with eyes, instincts, and a code no one could strip away. He felt the old war inside him reignite. One voice hissed, "She's a liability, a rogue, a threat to command itself." Another voice, older and quieter, whispered back, "She's the only reason those men are alive." Duty to orders, duty to lives. Which mattered more? He stared at the mic, at the silent channel where her voice had come through only once. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't waiting for clearance. She was flying because someone had to. For the first time in his career, man of rules, man of procedures, felt the ground shift under his feet. He realized that sometimes the book wasn't just useless. Sometimes it was the enemy. And as Falcon 7 banked into another run, engines howling against the storm, he couldn't decide what chilled him more. That she was breaking every rule he lived by. Or that she was right to. How do you explain a miracle when every law you've lived by says it cannot exist? The command center at Fort sat in silence, heavy and unbreathing, long after the last echo of the GAU-8's thunder had faded. Screens still glowed, consoles still hummed, but no one moved. Colonel stood at the console, staring at the tactical map where red blips, the enemy positions, had turned to smoke-gray ghosts. The impossible had unfolded in front of them. 12 men who should have been dead were alive, not because of the system, not because of the chain of command, but because a ghost had answered a call no one else dared to. A junior officer whispered the thought that no one wanted to speak aloud. "She's not supposed to exist." The words echoed in his mind. He had condemned the A-10 as a relic. He had sworn by the manual, trusted the rules, defended the system his entire career. And now his worldview had been shattered in less than 10 minutes. A pilot who was erased from history had returned from nowhere and done what the most advanced fleet in the world could not. The comms console sputtered again, breaking the silence. Echo 3's voice was raw, breathless, filled with disbelief. "Base, this is Echo 3. The artillery is gone. The pilot, she's not human. 60 rounds, 3 nests down, we're still breathing. Are you getting this?" The room erupted in a wave of sound, half cheers, half stunned murmurs. Even the radar tech Miller, a man whose face rarely betrayed anything, sat back in his chair as if trying to catch his breath. "What just happened?" someone asked. Not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself. Another officer spoke up, her voice trembling as she scrolled through telemetry logs. "Sir, the numbers don't make sense. She didn't fly with systems. She flew with instinct. Look at this." She pushed data onto the main display, Falcon 7's flight path. It wasn't just low altitude. It wasn't just reckless. It was artistry. She had woven her jet through the ravines and ridges as if the land itself were her weapon. Every angle gave her a perfect line of sight. Every bank of her wings used the terrain as cover. Stared at the holographic replay. He'd spent his life demanding precision from machines, demanding obedience from people. But what he saw here wasn't obedience. It was defiance turned into mastery. A voice broke the spell, deep, weathered, belonging to a man who had lived more sky than ground. A retired A-10 pilot named Frank, who had been standing in the back of the room like a silent relic himself, finally spoke. "That," he said softly, "isn't just skill. That's survival flying. She's flown in places where every shot had to count, where missing wasn't an option, where there were no systems to save you, no second chances. That's a kind of flying this generation doesn't even believe exists anymore." The ops room fell quiet again, not the silence of disbelief, but of reverence. His chest tightened. His eyes flicked from the replay to the sealed door of his memory. Operation Red Dagger. He had tried to forget, tried to bury it beneath years of protocol and paperwork. But the ghost of that mission now stood in front of him, alive in green radar lines and black smoke on the battlefield. He remembered the signature, the flight profile, the audacity, Falcon 7. He whispered her name before he even realized it. The young officer who had first suggested the A-10 looked up sharply. "Sir." Straightened, his mask snapping back into place. "Get me every file you can on Operation Red Dagger, everything on Falcon 7. I want to know why she isn't on any roster, and I want it now." The technician froze. "Sir, those files are sealed, restricted clearance." "I don't care if they're buried under the Pentagon," growled. "She just saved 12 soldiers. The system failed them and she didn't. Get me those files." The room stirred with a new kind of energy. This was no longer about a rescue. This was a hunt, a search not for an enemy but for a truth long buried. Minutes crawled, keys clacked, access requests were sent, warnings about restricted data flashed across screens, digital gates rose and fell. The staff worked like archaeologists digging through layers of stone, each click another inch closer to something buried for a reason. Finally, a file appeared on the central display. A single name burned across the top. "Call sign Falcon 7. The air shifted. Everyone leaned in. A senior officer who had been silent all night stepped forward, his voice low, almost haunted. "I remember Red Dagger. I was a junior then. 6 birds down in the first wave. 22 crew gone in minutes. The intel was bad from the start." He paused, his eyes fixed on the screen. Command declared the survivors unrecoverable, too dangerous, too costly. The stand-down order was absolute, but that's not what happened. The file unfolded, line by line, each sentence another nail pulled from a coffin. She hadn't been assigned to Red Dagger. She wasn't even on the flight log. She was standby at an auxiliary field, forgotten by a system that had already decided who lived and who died. But when the comms went silent, when the last fragmented cries for help crackled through before dying into static, she launched. No clearance, no support, no wingman, just her and a warthog against a sky that had already swallowed 6 aircraft. Felt the room fade, his own voice rasped, barely audible. How did she find them? The older officer answered with the weight of someone who had carried the memory too long. She didn't coordinate a rescue. She became the rescue. She drew the fire. Over 8 hours, 17 runs through the kill zone. She lit herself up like a flare so medevac teams could crawl forward. She gave them space. She gave them time. She gave them a chance. His throat tightened. He could see it. Her jet shredded, smoke pouring from its engines, hydraulics bleeding out. And still she stayed. Any other pilot would have ejected. She landed instead, skidding that bird onto a rural road 20 meters outside the hot zone, crawled out bleeding, burned but alive. And so were the 18 she had gone in for. Then why was she suspended? He asked, though he already knew. The technician's voice was ice. Because she broke a direct order. Those 18 were classified unrecoverable. Command told her to stand down. She didn't. The file showed the hearing. Clinical. Cold. 2 options offered: accept a reprimand and keep flying, or challenge the ruling and be discharged. Her response, buried in footnotes, now lit up on the screen. "I won't apologize for saving 18 people. If that gets me kicked out, so be it." The room fell into silence again. Not the stunned silence of disbelief this time, but the heavy silence of shame. His jaw clenched. He saw his own signature on the documents. He had been one of those who signed off on the stand-down, one of those who had silently condemned men as unrecoverable. Now the irony cut like a blade. He had buried her once, and she had come back not for glory, not for redemption, but to do the same thing again. The file scrolled further. Unofficial logs appeared, compiled by someone who hadn't let the story die. 17 unsanctioned rescues in 3 years, each time following a mission cancellation, each time 0 deaths, 0 failures. The realization struck like a punch. Falcon 7 wasn't a ghost who had returned once. She had been there all along, watching, listening, appearing only when the system chose silence. A phantom, a shadow guardian, a legend being carved not by victory but by refusal. His voice was low, almost reverent now. She's tapped into our comms. She's waiting for the calls we don't answer. The air in the room grew colder. Not fear, not dread, but the chill of something bigger than any one man, bigger than any one system. Falcon 7 wasn't just a pilot. She was a mirror, a living reminder that the rules weren't enough, that sometimes the only way to serve was to disobey. Looked at the blank space where her radar blip had been minutes ago. He knew she was gone again, vanished into silence. But for the first time, he didn't see it as defiance. He saw it as truth. She flew not for them, not for the medals, not even for herself. She flew because someone had to. And that was the most terrifying and the most hopeful thing of all. Where do legends go when the guns fall silent? Hours had passed since Falcon 7's roar shook the valley and saved Echo 3. The operations center at Fort had calmed, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't relief. It wasn't celebration. It was reflection, an unsettling quiet where every man and woman present replayed what they had seen, trying to convince themselves it had been real. The green blip was gone from the radar. The comms were dead air. She had come, she had delivered the impossible, and she had vanished just as quickly. Colonel sat at his console, the weight of the night pressing into his bones. The files on still glowed faintly on the screen before him. Her history was no longer rumor, it was fact. Operation Red Dagger, the rescues buried in silence. The hearing, the single line she had offered as her defense, "I won't apologize for saving 18 people." He had read it over and over until the words had etched themselves into his mind. They were not defiance. They were conviction. And conviction was something he had lost years ago, traded for rules, protocols, signatures on forms. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. A security officer stepped in stiff, nervous. "Sir, we've had an anomaly at Auxiliary Field C9. His head snapped up. "What kind of anomaly?" The officer swallowed. "An A-10, sir. No flight plan, no transponder, sitting on the strip, engines cold, cockpit empty." His heart stumbled in his chest. He didn't need to ask for a description. He already knew. He stood without a word. The drive out to C9 was long and lonely, headlights carving through pre-dawn mist. For it felt less like a journey and more like a pilgrimage. Each mile pulled him further away from the sterile certainty of the command center and closer to something raw, something elemental. When he arrived, the auxiliary field was locked down. Guards stood at the perimeter, unsure of what they were protecting or why. And there, in the middle of the strip, rested the warthog. It looked nothing like the relic he had dismissed hours earlier. It wasn't a blunt, lumbering hammer. It was a survivor. Its armor bore scars like a soldier's skin. Its panels carried the fingerprints of someone who had poured care and devotion into every rivet, every line. Walked toward it slowly, almost reverently. The closer he got, the more he understood. This wasn't just a machine. It was a companion, a witness, a weapon turned sanctuary in the hands of the right pilot. He climbed the ladder and pulled himself into the cockpit. What he found there stunned him. It wasn't the wreckage he expected from an antique aircraft flown through hell. It was immaculate. Every gauge was clean, every switch polished. Systems had been rebuilt, modified, modernized, not by a team, but by a pair of hands that knew this bird better than they knew themselves. On the dashboard sat a folded piece of paper. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was simple, steady, unadorned. Not here for medals, just for proof they made it. He read it 3 times before lowering the paper. It wasn't written for him. It wasn't written for anyone. It was a reminder to herself, a creed, a vow. Behind him, a maintenance NCO approached quietly, his boots crunching against the tarmac. "Sir," he said in a low, respectful tone, "you gave orders not to touch it, but I've been looking from a distance. This bird, it's cleaner than most of our fleet. Someone been caring for her, serious care." Handed him the note. The sergeant read it once, nodded, and handed it back without a word. His eyes said everything: reverence, disbelief, and something close to awe. Another voice joined them, older, seasoned. A veteran pilot drawn to the scene by whispers of the ghost jet. His gaze lingered on the warthog, and when he spoke, it was almost a prayer. "This isn't just upkeep," he murmured. "This is love. Someone loves this jet. You don't polish switches like that for a paycheck. You don't reinforce armor like that for orders. That's personal." His throat tightened. He looked at the bird again, not as a commander but as a man. Every scar told a story. Every modification whispered of a pilot who had refused to let her machine, or herself, become obsolete. For the first time in decades, Fortress of Logic cracked wide open. Rules, protocols, the sacred manual, none of it mattered here. This was truth. A woman, a machine, and a promise that no system could erase. He turned to the sergeant. His voice was steady but different, less command, more conviction. "Move this aircraft to Hangar 7, behind security. Do not log it. Do not process it as evidence. Treat it as a reserve unit. Someone might need it again." The order was quiet, but everyone who heard it knew it was the beginning of something new. The warthog was rolled into Hangar 7 under the cover of darkness. No ceremony, no record, just a handful of men who understood they were moving more than a machine. They were moving a relic, a monument, a sentinel. And then the whispers began. At first they were soft, passed between crew chiefs and pilots. "There's a jet in 7, it's spotless, it's always fueled, always armed, but no one ever touches it, no one ever logs it." Night shift guards swore they saw shadows slipping past patrols, figures vanishing into the mist, only for the bird to gleam a little cleaner, a little sharper the next morning. Maintenance reports stopped making sense. Fuel tanks were always topped off, ammo racks always stocked, though no request had ever been filed. When was told, he didn't question. He just gave the same faint, knowing smile. "Maybe they're not meant to be caught. Some things work better when we don't get in the way." Hangar 7 became sacred ground, not officially, not on paper, but in the way soldiers know when something is bigger than them. Pilots would wander there between sorties, standing in silence before the bird as if visiting a memorial. Young recruits, wide-eyed, whispered stories they weren't sure they believed. Veterans touched the armor with quiet reverence. It wasn't just the jet they were seeing, it was what it represented. In a world ruled by protocols, signatures, and clearance codes, the A-10 in Hangar 7 was proof that sometimes the rules failed, and that someone somewhere refused to let failure be the last word. Began to change, too. The man who had once dismissed the warthog as obsolete now found himself visiting the hangar alone. He would stand in the shadow of its wings, hands clasped behind his back, and think about the note. Not for medals, just for proof they made it. He had led by the book his whole career, but here was proof, etched into steel, inked onto a piece of paper, that the book wasn't always enough. And slowly, without announcing it, rewrote his own command philosophy. He began leaving one channel open on missions deemed too dangerous. An untraceable frequency, never logged, never acknowledged, just left open, just in case. Sometimes it stayed quiet. Other times it came alive. A single message, flashing across the comms board like a beacon in the dark. Falcon 7 in vicinity. There was never further confirmation. No signature. No call sign repeated, just those words. But the room would change instantly. Where despair had been, anticipation grew. Where silence weighed heavy, hope returned. Because that signal meant one thing: someone was still coming. Stopped thinking of her as a liability. He stopped thinking of her as a rogue. He started thinking of her as insurance. And in Hangar 7, in the quiet of night, the Warthog waited, always spotless, always armed, always fueled, always ready. A machine, a shrine, a legend in steel. And knew, as he touched the cold metal one night under dim hangar lights, that he had been wrong all his life about what command meant. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about making sure someone came home. How does a ghost become more than a person? Sometimes it happens slowly, not with headlines, not with speeches, but with whispers that slip under doors and ride on the backs of engines. At Fort, the Warthog in Hangar 7 was never logged, never mentioned in reports, never included in inventories. Yet everyone knew it was there. Pilots found reasons to wander that way on off hours, leaning against the cool steel of its armor, tracing the faint scorch marks that still its panels. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't need to. The silence was its own kind of reverence. Ground crews reported strange things. The jet was always immaculate. No dust, no oil streaks, no empty tanks. Yet no maintenance orders ever existed. It's like it fixes itself, one crew chief muttered, half in awe, half in fear. Others swore they'd seen fleeting shadows slipping in and out of the hangar after midnight. When challenged, would only say, maybe some things aren't meant to be caught. And so Hangar 7 became sacred ground. Not officially, not by order, but in the way soldiers and pilots instinctively recognize something larger than themselves. Veterans visited quietly. Young recruits were led there in silence, wide-eyed, their disbelief melting as they stood before the old bird and felt something they couldn't explain. This wasn't built in a shop, one whispered. This was carved in combat. Over time, Falcon 7 stopped being just a name. She became an idea. The myth grew like ivy, creeping into corners where even command couldn't reach. When missions were canceled, too risky, too costly, the comms officers would glance at, a silent question. He never gave long answers, just a nod. And then one untraceable channel would be left open. Sometimes nothing came. Other times, a single message would flicker through like a ghost knocking at the door. Falcon 7 in vicinity. No explanation, no follow-up, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. Hope, the kind that didn't ask permission. It was himself who made the myth permanent. Not with a speech, not with an order, but with something quieter, something that matched her style. In the main hall of Fort's headquarters, he had a plaque mounted, small, matte steel, no rank, no insignia, just the silhouette of an A-10 flying low, cutting through fog. Beneath it, 2 words etched in silence. Falcon 7. He didn't announce it, he didn't explain, he simply had it placed, and yet word spread. Pilots began to lead each other there, pointing not with pride but with reverence. When someone asked, who was Falcon 7, the answer was always spoken softly. Someone who knew saving lives matters more than following orders. The myth no longer belonged to one woman. It had become a philosophy, a quiet doctrine whispered in flight briefings, carried in the glances exchanged when the system hesitated. Found himself changed, too. The man who had once dismissed the A-10 as obsolete now carried its silhouette in his mind like a talisman. He visited Hangar 7 in the evenings, standing alone in the dim light, staring at the bird that waited there like a sentinel. He no longer saw a relic, he saw a reminder. Sometimes he would climb into the cockpit, sit where she had sat, and look at the folded note still tucked into the dash. Not here for medals, just for proof they made it. He never moved it, never touched it, it wasn't his to claim. And yet it changed him. He began to see his role differently. Command wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about making sure someone answered when the rules failed. His staff noticed it, though he never said a word. Missions once deemed hopeless now carried a sliver of hope, a sliver left open on an untraceable channel. And when that faint signal came, Falcon 7 in vicinity, the entire mood shifted. Despair gave way to anticipation. She was more than a rogue, more than a pilot. She was insurance. Insurance that when command said, "Too risky," someone still whispered back, "Not on my watch." One evening walked the quiet halls of headquarters and stopped at the plaque. He stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the silhouette of the A-10. He thought of the men she had saved, the men he would have lost if not for her. He thought of Red Dagger, of the signature he had once scrawled on a stand-down order, condemning 18 men as unrecoverable, men she had brought home alive. The irony weighed heavy, but so did the revelation. For the first time in his long career, understood that true command wasn't about signatures or rules. It was about knowing when the book became a cage, and when someone had to tear its pages apart to let others breathe. He reached out, let his fingers brush the cold steel of the plaque, and whispered, "You were right." No one heard him, and that was fine. Some truths didn't need an audience. The myth spread beyond the base. Other units whispered of her, a phantom who appeared when orders said retreat, a ghost jet carving hope through fog. They never knew her name, never knew the face behind the mask, but they knew the sound, the growl of a warthog, and what it meant. Hope. It was never loud, never celebrated, but it grew, quiet and unstoppable. And in Hangar 7 the warthog waited, always spotless, always armed, always ready. Not a relic, not a museum piece. A monument. And every soldier who stood before it felt the same unspoken truth settle in their bones. Sometimes the bravest acts don't ask permission. They just take flight. What does a commander take with him when he leaves? For Colonel, it wasn't medals, not commendations, not the weight of decades of service, though he carried those too. When his retirement orders came through, stamped with the indifferent finality of bureaucracy, he realized what mattered most wasn't listed on any paper. It was silence, the silence of Hangar 7, the silence of an untraceable channel that still flickered to life when men were desperate, the silence of a name spoken softly, never shouted, Falcon 7. On his last morning at Fort, walked the halls slowly, committing every detail to memory. The buzz of the operations room, the muted chatter of analysts poring over maps, the smell of coffee that had been left too long on the burner. He had lived here longer than he had lived anywhere else. But home, he realized now, wasn't the walls. It was the people and the truths they carried. He paused at the plaque in the main hall. The silhouette of the A-10 gleamed faintly in the morning light. Beneath it, the words, Falcon 7. He stood there longer than he intended. The years played out behind his eyes like reels of film. The night Echo 3 was saved. The sealed files he had unearthed. The warthog rolled into Hangar 7 under the cover of darkness. The first time he had whispered into an open frequency, not knowing if anyone would answer. And the answers that had come. Falcon 7 in vicinity. It was never more than that, but it was always enough. His successor, a younger colonel named Hayes, approached from behind. A man shaped by numbers, sharp in uniform and sharp in mind, still clinging to the certainty that rules provided. He stopped when he saw at the plaque. "You're still thinking about her," Hayes said. Not as an accusation, more like a curiosity. Didn't turn, not about her, about what she represents. Hayes crossed his arms. A rogue pilot, a phantom no one can prove exists. I'll be honest, sir, I'm not sure why you've let this go on so long. Smiled faintly, though his eyes remained on the steel plaque. Because proof isn't always the point. Hayes frowned, then what is? Finally turned, his gaze steady, his voice calm but weighted. Hope. The kind of hope the manual doesn't write about. The kind that shows up when the system fails. You'll understand one day. Until then, keep a channel open. Hayes shook his head, half amused, half bewildered. You really believe she's still out there? Looked back at the plaque, at the shadow of the A-10 frozen in flight. Belief has nothing to do with it. She's still flying. The only question is whether you'll let yourself see her. He left it at that. No further explanation. Some truths couldn't be handed over in briefings. They had to be lived. That evening, walked to Hangar 7 one final time. The guards let him through without question. He stepped into the cool quiet of the space and stood before the warthog. The bird looked as it always had, spotless, fueled, ready. No fingerprints, no dust, no sign of human hands, and yet it carried a presence as though it breathed in silence. Rested his hand on the cold armor. You were right, he whispered again. It's not about medals, it's about proof. He left the hangar without looking back. The next morning he was gone, his nameplate removed from the door, his desk emptied, his voice no longer in the comms room. But Falcon 7 remained. Weeks later, a mission ran hot. A recon patrol pinned deep in the eastern ranges, outnumbered and cut off. The weather closed in, satellites lost the feed, drones were grounded, and command ordered a stand down. Colonel Hayes sat in the chair once occupied, the manual in his hands. Every calculation told him to pull back, to let the men go. His staff shifted nervously, waiting for his verdict. For long moments, Hayes said nothing. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward the empty frequency had always kept open. The voice of his training screamed, protocol, orders, obedience. But in the back of his mind lingered words, keep a channel open. With a quiet sigh, Hayes nodded to the comms officer. Leave one line open, just in case. It felt foolish, like grasping at smoke, but the officer obeyed. Minutes crawled. Enemy fire grew heavier. Desperation thickened the room like smoke. And then, against all logic, against every rule of probability, the comms board flickered. Falcon 7 in vicinity. The room froze. No one breathed. Hayes stared at the words, his face pale, his hand trembling as he reached for the mic. Falcon 7, this is command. Identify yourself. Silence. Then faint, steady, unshaken. No time for introductions. Tell me where they are. Hayes's voice cracked as he read the coordinates. His staff leaned in, wide-eyed, whispering prayers. Moments later, the sky over the eastern ranges split with the roar of an A-10. On the ground, the patrol braced for death, until the thunder came. The GAU-8 opened, precise and merciless, chewing through enemy fire, carving open a corridor of survival. Direct hit, targets suppressed. Voices screamed over the comms. The patrol was moving, alive, scrambling through the chaos Falcon 7 created. In the command room, Hayes gripped the console with white knuckles. The myth was no longer a myth. It was happening in front of him. Falcon 7 flew like no one else. Low, reckless, surgical, every run impossibly precise, every round buying another second of life for men who should have been written off. And then just as quickly she was gone. No transponder, no comms, only silence. Hayes stood frozen, his chest heaving. Around him, his staff erupted with relief, disbelief, awe. One officer whispered the truth no one could deny anymore. She's real. Hayes's gaze drifted toward the hall, toward the plaque had left behind. For the first time, he understood. Proof wasn't always about photographs or signatures. Sometimes proof was survival. Sometimes proof was 12 men walking back from a valley they should never have left alive. He turned back to his team, voice steady now. Keep that channel open, always. That night Hayes visited Hangar 7. The guard stepped aside. He walked into the quiet space and froze. The warthog was gone. The hangar stood empty, silent, its walls echoing with absence. On the concrete floor, resting where the jet had once been, lay a single folded note. Hayes bent, picked it up with trembling hands. The handwriting was the same, simple, steady. Still flying. His breath caught. He closed his eyes, the paper trembling between his fingers. Had been right. Proof wasn't medals. Proof was knowing someone was still out there when everything else said no. And as he stood alone in Hangar 7, Hayes finally understood what Falcon 7 had become. Not just a rogue, not just a pilot, not just a ghost. A promise. How far can a whisper travel? Farther than bullets, farther than orders, sometimes farther than truth itself. At first, Falcon 7 was spoken of only inside Fort, a ghost that command never confirmed, a pilot whose name was never written. But whispers do not obey walls, and soldiers do not keep quiet about salvation. The story of the Phantom Warthog bled into other bases, into other units, into places no memo could reach. A Marine squad in Kandahar claimed they'd been pinned by mortar fire until an A-10 roared through a storm that grounded every other bird. No flight logs listed her, but the men swore the cannon that saved them belonged to her. "No one else flies like that," their sergeant said. "Low, close, like she was dragging us out with her own hands." An Army Ranger team in the Philippines reported a similar story. A canceled extraction, a hopeless fight, and then the growl of a warthog tearing open the night. When debriefed, the Ranger captain said only, "I don't care what you call her. All I know is I've got men alive today because she didn't wait for permission." And then the Allies began to speak. A French patrol in Mali, a British unit in Helmand, an Australian recon team in Timor. Each told the same impossible tale, abandoned, outnumbered, written off by command until the Phantom appeared. No transponder, no name, just the thunder of a GAU-8 and then survival. At first, higher command tried to dismiss it. Coincidence, they said. Misreporting, A-10s are still in circulation. But the details were too precise, the patterns too uncanny. Different theaters, different wars, the same presence. And always the same words carried through the comms, quiet and unshakable. Falcon 7 in vicinity. It became more than a phrase. It became a lifeline, a superstition, a promise whispered into radios by men on the brink of death, hoping the ghost might hear. At Fort, Hangar 7 remained empty, the jet long gone, but the plaque in the hall grew heavier with meaning. Pilots from other bases began visiting as if it were a shrine. Some touched the steel and whispered thanks. Others left tokens, patches, letters, folded notes tucked into the corners. One morning, successor Colonel Hayes walked the hall to find a small crowd of international officers gathered around the plaque. They weren't Americans, a Brit, a Frenchman, an Australian. They stood in silence, hats in hand, paying respects not to a person they knew, but to the idea she had become. Hayes didn't interrupt. He understood. Some truths were shared in silence. The myth had the base, the country. It was no longer a secret one unit carried. It was a story soldiers around the world passed to one another, a reminder that when command said no, someone might still say yes. She became a cautionary tale to some, a threat to order, a rogue pilot who protocol undermined chain of command. But for the ones on the ground, the ones left bleeding in dust and smoke, she was something else entirely. Hope. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was a movement. Command tried to stamp it out. Memos circulated, warnings against spreading unauthorized narratives. Officers were instructed not to acknowledge the rumors. Analysts tried to trace the comms, but the signal always vanished like smoke. Yet the harder they tried to bury it, the stronger it grew. Because soldiers don't worship rules. They worship proof. And proof was written in the lives still breathing, the voices still calling home after missions that should have ended in silence. Falcon 7 became a code. In briefing rooms across continents, when plans faltered and extraction seemed impossible, someone would mutter, "Leave a line open." It was a phrase that carried weight, a quiet defiance hidden inside procedure. And though no one said her name aloud, everyone knew what it meant. Sometimes that line stayed quiet. Other times it answered. And every time it did, the legend grew. An Allied general once scoffed at the stories, calling them childish folklore. But later, when his own convoy was cut off in a valley no drone could penetrate, he felt the ground shake with the unmistakable roar of a warthog. His staff recorded his words afterward, spoken in disbelief as he stared into the smoke. "I saw her. I swear I saw her. And I don't believe in ghosts." Back at Fort, Hayes found himself living in two worlds. To his superiors, he everything. To his men, he left the channel open. And in his private hours, he returned to the empty hangar, to the note that still lay on the concrete floor. Still flying. He kept it locked in his desk, folded carefully, the edges worn from being read too many times. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't proof. It was something better. It was faith made tangible. One night during a storm that grounded half the fleet, Hayes stood at the window of the ops room, watching lightning split the sky. He thought of her out there, somewhere, cutting through clouds with eyes sharper than instruments, carrying a creed no reprimand could erase. Not here for medals, just for proof they made it. And he realized what had tried to teach him all along. Falcon 7 was no longer about one woman in a cockpit. She was an idea, and ideas can't be grounded. They move too fast, they fly too low, they survive. The whisper had become a roar. And across the world, soldiers in impossible places carried the same quiet truth in their hearts. If the book closes on you, if command says there's no way out, leave a line open. Because sometimes the impossible still answers. What is the last sound a legend leaves behind? Not always the roar of engines. Sometimes it's silence. A silence that lingers long after the skies are clear. The war in the northern range had dragged on longer than anyone expected. Supply lines stretched thin. Morale crumbled. Command began to speak in terms of acceptable losses, as though lives were numbers that could be erased without leaving ghosts. A platoon of special operators was stranded in a ravine, cut off by artillery that had the high ground. The request for air cover climbed through channels, each layer stripping it down until it reached the same word again and again. Too risky, too costly, too late. The men on the ground heard only static. They had been told the system had abandoned them. But Hayes sat in the command center, the weight of memory pressing against his ribs. He stared at the request, his pen hovering over the logbook. Protocol screamed for him to close the file. Instead, he leaned forward and whispered the words that had become second nature. "Leave one channel open." The room went still. The officer at comms nodded, his hands trembling. The frequency stayed alive, a candle flickering in the wind. Minutes passed. Nothing. The sound of artillery echoed over the comms from the ravine, each impact shaking the operators closer to death. Hayes closed his eyes, hearing their muffled shouts, their attempts to move. He wondered if maybe the ghost had finally gone quiet for good. And then it came. Falcon 7 in vicinity. The words appeared like a heartbeat, calm, unshaken, impossible. The ops room erupted with gasps, but Hayes raised a hand, steady, holding them quiet. His chest ached as he leaned toward the mic. "Coordinates transmitted. They need you now." No reply came, but moments later the earth trembled. From the storm-wrapped sky above the northern range, the warthog appeared. She didn't descend like an angel. She tore through the clouds like defiance itself, skimming the ridges, cannon screaming thunder. The artillery on the high ground never stood a chance. Precision bursts chewed through batteries, silencing fire that had pinned the platoon for hours. Every run was merciless, every strike exact. On the ground, the operators surged forward, dragging their wounded, hearts pounding with a hope they hadn't felt since the first shell landed. Above them, Falcon 7 carved the sky into a shield. And then silence again. The last artillery nest crumbled, the operators moved, the Warthog pulled up through fog and vanished. No sign, no transponder, no name. Only the absence where she had been. In the command center, Hayes stood rooted, his pulse hammering. Around him, voices clamored, officers scrambling for explanation, for evidence, for anything that could anchor what they had just witnessed. But Hayes knew better. Proof was standing right now in a ravine where men should have been dead. Proof was the sound of their voices crackling back into the comms as they reached safe ground. Proof wasn't medals. It was survival. Hours later, when the last of the rescued operators limped through the gates of Fort, battered but alive, Hayes walked alone to Hangar 7. The space was empty as it had been for months. No Warthog, no roar of engines, only the faint echo of memory. On the floor, just where the last note had once been, lay another scrap of paper, small, folded, left in silence. Hayes knelt, hands trembling, and opened it. The handwriting was the same. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. His breath caught. He sat there in the quiet hangar, the note heavy in his hands. He understood now what it understood, what every whisper around the world had been building toward. Falcon 7 was never flying for herself, not for rank, not for recognition. She was flying for proof. Proof that no man was beyond saving if someone still had the will to try. Proof that rules may end where humanity begins. Proof that silence can be louder than speeches, and that action, even when unseen, can echo longer than glory. The Warthog would not return to Hangar 7. Not now. Maybe not ever. Legends don't retire into museums. They vanish into the skis they were born from, leaving only echoes and stories. But Hayes knew, every soldier who lived to see another dawn knew that she was still out there. Maybe not forever, maybe not always, but somewhere in the vast silence between orders and outcomes, she was still flying. And that was enough. The plaque in the hall remained. Soldiers still paused before it, hats in hand. Recruits still touched the cold steel as if it carried warmth. Allies still whispered her name like a prayer. Not a rank, not a medal, not a face. Just two words etched into silence. Falcon 7. And when the next war came, when the next stand-down order fell heavy, when men once again found themselves written off as unrecoverable, someone would remember the truth. Leave one channel open. Because sometimes the impossible still answers.